Hi all, so welcome to week 6. So in this week we're going to be talking about the open future, and in this first video my aim is really to talk about different senses of openness. So we have this intuition. I think it's fairly clear that we've got this intuition. I share this intuition that the future is somehow open, and in this video we're going to be talking about different senses of what exactly it means, or when we have this intuition that the future is open, what exactly does that amount to? And we're going to be looking at that. Before we get started though on some of the details, it's worth noting that we've already touched upon the open future in relation to the different views that we've been looking at. So in particular, we've seen that there are an eternalist position. So eternalism is the ontological view that the past, the present and the future are all equally as real, as you should now be aware. And there are two different eternalist views. There's B-theory eternalism, and according to B-theory eternalism, the whole of time is laid out. So no particular moment of time is privileged, so there's nothing special about the present moment. So the term now, or the present, is just an indexical and picks out the time at which we are at and nothing more. So it functions similar to here. This should be familiar to you by now. So that's the B theory, but there's also the A theory eternalist view, and that's the moving spotlight view, according to which there is something special about the present moment, and they try to explain the flow of time in terms of the present moment moving along the timeline into the future. But nonetheless, on both of those views, the future is already there, and that means that there's a sense in which, so if we're going to have human outposts on Mars in 2100, they're already there. It's out there in the future in much the same way that we think that the past, actually presentists don't, but okay, on the eternalist view, the present and the future and the past mirror each other. There's no real difference between them, so on their view the future exists in the same way as the past does, and so it looks as though they're going to have to say it's fixed in the same way that the past is. Now there are other views, the A theory views of presentism and the growing block view, and on those two views the future, it doesn't already exist, it's yet to come into existence. The presentist looks as though they're going to have a symmetry between the past and the future, and maybe you think that's a problem. But the growing block view is the one that we've sort of said seems to, at any rate, give some sort of or explain or fit with our intuitions best. Our intuitions there seem to be the past is fixed, and the growing block view, it's already there, so that makes sense. The future is open. The growing block view, well, the future doesn't yet exist, so it's not there, and that seems to fit as well. But that is good. It seems to give us, if we think that our intuitions on this matter are to be, at least give prima facie reason to believe that there's something to these intuitions, then it seems to give us a good reason to think that the growing block view has an advantage there. And part of what I want to do today is to ask, well, is that really the case? Yes. And that's going to depend upon what we really mean, what this intuition is and what it amounts to, that the future is open. So that's why we need to look at this in a bit more detail. As I said, I share this intuition, and it looks as though the intuition has been had by people for millennia. The most famous account, or the first time this really gets spelled out in any detail, is by Aristotle again. So we saw in week 1, we talked a bit about Aristotle's views on time, and they were bloody complicated and hard to understand. The idea of the now somehow doesn't really exist, but is a cut in the timeline and mind dependent and all that kind of a stuff, which I did my best to try and give some sort of an account of, but nobody really has been able to get a handle on exactly what Aristotle was talking about. It's horrendously confusing. Anyway, this is different. This is a separate, it's in a different writing of Aristotle. It's in, well, as I say here, De Interpretatione, and this is different. It's independent of his other views on time and much easier to get a handle on, I think. Although that's not to say that there haven't been lots of different interpretations of what he's saying. I'm not going to dwell upon those interpretations. I might give you the Elizabeth Anscombe has got a nice article on this, which I might post as one of the extra readings if you're interested. But we're not going to dwell upon the interpretation. But let's have a look at this quote so that we can see what he's saying. So here it is. He says, so he's talking about this sea battle, this sea fight. He says, a sea fight must either take place tomorrow or not. But it is not necessary that it should take place tomorrow, neither is it necessary that it should not take place. Yet it is necessary that it either should or should not take place tomorrow. One may indeed be more likely to be true than the other, but it cannot be either actually true or actually false. And this is an expression of this idea that things that are coming up in the future are somehow not yet fixed. That people have taken it to mean that, and it seems pretty clear that it does. But a couple of quick things that I want to pick up on here. So down the bottom, when Aristotle says it's not actually true or actually false, I mean, he uses cannot there, but here, here we've got the idea that it's necessary that it takes place. Here it's just that it's actually true. So it looks as though Aristotle is kind of conflating it not being actually true in the future and it not being necessarily true in the future, and that's going to be of interest to us. This idea of, I mean, do we really need to mention the notion of necessity in here? This is a modal notion, and we'll see that there's some interesting things to say about that. And actually, I think there's a very enlightening, simple thought in the end, I think, but it's quite enlightening once you get your head around it. And we're going to talk about that in the second video of this week. So we're going to talk about the connection between something being true and it being necessarily true, and think about how that plays out in terms of the future. So that'll be coming up. But at any rate, in this video, what I want to do is focus on, well, just first of all, the different senses that we might give to the idea that the future is open. Now, before I do that, I just want to give you a little puzzle, I suppose. So let's turn to my board briefly, and I just want to point this out. Well, let's just take a proposition. It will rain tomorrow. Okay. Or if you're not happy, because maybe you don't like this, because whether it rains or not, I mean, where are we talking? Maybe it can drizzle and then it's unclear, so maybe that's not the best example to use. We want something that's a kind of determinate proposition, no vagueness involved in it. So let's take, what about this one then? Next week's lottery will include, lottery results will include the number 6. Let's say. And here's a thought about this. So there's a proposition, we'll call that P. So we're just saying P means next week's lottery will include the number 6. Now, part of what Aristotle suggests, true that he uses the notion of necessity, which we're not going to talk about now, but he says it's necessary that either the sea battle will happen or it won't happen, but it's neither necessary that it will happen and not necessary that it won't happen. If we just put that in terms of forget the necessity and say, well, either it's true that next week's lottery will include the number 6, or it's false that next week's lottery will include the number 6, but it's neither true that it will and true that it won't, well, that's a slightly odd claim, and this is just something you to sort of think about as we go on, because it does look like this, well, P or not P, right, take the whole of that sentence, so, you know, we're taking that as a whole thing, P or not P is true. I mean, got to be true that either next week's lottery will include the number 6, or it's not the case that next week's lottery will include the number 6. We can surely not deny that P or not P is true, can we? I mean, that has to be true, right? Because there's no other option. Either it will or it won't. Okay? But if we're going to say that the future is open, then maybe what we want to say is, well, P or not P is true. Well, okay, here's the thought. When we say that P or not P, what is it that grounds the truth of a disjunction like that? What is it that makes a proposition that P or not P true? Well, the thought is, well, that's true because either P is true or not P is true. I mean, how else can P or not P be true unless one of the disjuncts, as we call them, one of the sides of the disjunction, one of the sides of the OR is true? So if we think that P or not P is true, doesn't that commit us to the idea that, whether we know it or not, doesn't this mean, or P or not P is true, we can put it like this, entails that, either P is true or not P is true. And of course, if P is true, then not P is false, and if not P is true, then P is false. Well, okay, that means, either that is true or... do you see what I'm getting at? There's this puzzle that if we want to say that it's neither true nor not true that next week's lottery will include the number 6, well, how can that be right if the disjunction that P or not P is itself true? Anyway, we'll come back to this later, this idea, but I just wanted to introduce that to you and make you think, well, hang on a minute, how are we supposed to make sense of the idea that a proposition about the future is neither true nor false? And to say that is just to say that the proposition is neither the proposition nor the negation of the proposition is true, it looks like. How can we make sense of that if we want to hold that the disjunction, P or not P in this case, is itself true? That's meant to be puzzling. I'm not expecting anyone's going to have an immediate sort of answer or thought about that. Maybe in the end we want to deny the disjunct or something like that. That's not true either. But that doesn't seem right either. So it's just a puzzle here about how this can be logically speaking. But okay, we'll come back to that issue. As I said, the main focus of today is on this sense of, well, what do we mean, or what does it amount to when we say that the future is open? So the main interpretation that we're going to focus on, in fact, I'm going to start with the one that I think is probably the right one to focus on, is known as alethic openness. Alethic comes from Greek for true and false. I can't remember exactly what it means, but it's a Greek term. So alethic openness, and we could give a definition of this. So to say that a proposition P is alethically open at a time t, so notice here that we've got the idea that it's tied to a particular time, and so take a particular proposition, any one you like. So let's take there will be outposts on Mars in 2020. So the idea that is alethically open at a time t, so now, so is it now open that there will be a human outpost on Mars in 2100, let's say? Well, that's going to be true, so this is defining what it means to say that, if it's not true at t, that P, and it's not false at t, that P. So, if we say, take the proposition, there will be human outposts on Mars by 2100, if that's alethically open, that just means that it's not true now that there will be human outposts on Mars, and it's not false now that there will be human outposts on Mars. Okay. As it stands, you might think, okay, that's not particularly illuminating. But I think when we contrast it with the other senses of openness, it will become a bit more illuminating. So that's it. It's a simple thought. What it means for a proposition P to be alethically open at any particular moment, so it being open now, and we're going to be interested about the present moment, is for it neither to be true now, is it for it not to be true now, and for it not to be false now. Alright. And by the way then, we can also use the expression proposition P is alethically closed, and a proposition is alethically closed if it doesn't meet either of those, or if it doesn't meet those two conditions. So a proposition P is alethically closed if and only if it is true, so either it is true at t that P, or it is false at t that P. So it's true, so there will be human outposts on Mars in 2100 is alethically closed if it's true now that there will be human outposts on Mars, or it's false now that there will be human outposts on Mars. Okay. So the second sense that I want to mention is the notion of epistemic openness. So, as you should now know, epistemic, epistemology, it's to do with knowledge, it's to do with how we know things and so on. Epistemic openness is just to do with whether something is known to be true or not. So I want to sharply distinguish this because there are lots of things which are either true or false which are epistemically open for particular agents, so we have to relativize this to an agent, and it just means basically you don't know it. I mean, so a proposition P is epistemically open for a particular agent A at a time t, if and only if P is neither known to be true nor known to be false by A at t. Right? So there are lots of propositions which are epistemically open for me. So let's try and think of one. In fact, how many stars there are in the universe? I don't know what the answer to that is. Presumably there is an answer to that question, but I don't know what it is. So, you know, I don't know. There are 1,500,625,223 stars in the universe. Take that proposition. Well, I don't know whether that's true or not. So it's epistemically open. It's not known to be true or known to be false by me. And presumably nobody knows that. There's just another way of putting it that might be a bit more accurate if the truth of P and the falsity of P is consistent with everything that I know at T. But you get the idea. And we're not really going to be focusing on this kind of openness, unless, of course, it is relevant, because maybe, I mean, I'll mention this later, maybe we can explain our intuition about the openness of the future in terms of epistemic openness. When we think the future is open and the past is closed, does that just mean that, well, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, or we haven't got any epistemic access to what's going to happen in the future, but we've got epistemic access to things that happened in the past, so we've got history records and so on, so we know stuff about the past, but we don't know stuff about the future. Because if that's all that intuition about openness amounts to, of course, that certainly would not support something like the growing block view, right? Because we don't need there to be no future, an existing past and a non-existing future in order to explain epistemic openness. All we need is the idea that, well, we've got some sort of epistemic access to the past but not to the future, and that can be perfectly well be true on an eternalist position. So, at any rate, it doesn't seem to capture the idea. The idea that the future is open seems to be more than epistemic openness, so we're not going to be focusing too much on this. Okay. So, that's to bring this up in order to discard it, really. The third notion is one of modal openness, and modal here is to do with necessity and possibility. And here we define the proposition. A proposition is modally open, so proposition P, missed out the P, is modally open at a time t, if and only if it's possible at t that the proposition is true. I'll tell you what, let's put this in. So a proposition P is modally open at a time t, if and only if it's possible at t that, I'll put it in, P is true, and it's possible that P is false. Let's put it like that. That's probably better. Okay. So, yes, a modally open proposition. Take again the one about the human outposts on Mars in 2100. That proposition is going to be modally open at time t if it's possible now that it's true that there will be a human outpost on Mars in 2100, or it's possible now that it's false that there will be a human outpost on Mars. By the way, just at the moment I'm just outlining these senses of openness. We'll give them some application as we go. So at the moment, if it's a bit confusing, or you're not quite sure how this is going to play into what we talk about, just bear with it, go with it, and because we're going to have something to say about this notion, and this relates to the relation between alethic openness and modal openness relates to this illuminating thought. And I think once we get through to it in the second video and you see the idea, it is illuminating. It does sort of make you think, yeah, and yeah, so we'll see. We'll come to that. So just bear with this for the moment. The final sense of openness then that I want to talk about is causal openness. We're not going to be talking too much about this one either. But here we talk about time being causally open rather than a proposition. And this is just the thought that, well, okay, a particular time is causally open if the actions we perform now can have some causal influence on what happens at that time. So we usually think that most, so the year 2100 is causally open because stuff that we're going to do now is going to have a causal influence on what happens in the future. I want to mention this one, and because maybe it'll come up in the seminar, maybe some people, there are issues to do this and confusing this with the other senses of openness, alethic and modal. And there are some very interesting issues here which we're not really going to be talking about, but maybe they'll come up in the seminar and we can talk about them there if you want. So alright, just to summarise briefly, and I know at the moment that this not clear where this is all going. It is going somewhere, we'll see. But just to summarise, we've just outlined 4 different senses of openness. There's alethic openness, epistemic openness, modal openness, and causal openness. I've kind of rejected already epistemic openness as being the one that we mean when we have the intuition, or one that kind of gives substance to the intuition that the future is open. We mean more than just we don't know about the future, in other words, when we say, or the intuition that the future is open is more than just the intuition that we don't know about the future, I think. I don't think it's this causal openness because, you know, we obviously think that we can causally affect the future, and that can be true on an eternalist picture. Of course, you know, even on an eternalist picture where the future is already laid out, well, you know, things that happen now causally affect things in the future. And we can talk about that a bit more, but it's very obvious that that's true. So it's not this one either. So it's either going to be alethic or modal openness, which is the important one. And now we need to ask about the relation between those. So here's the question, and this is what I want to talk about in the next video. Does alethic closedness entail modal closedness? So I'll say more about this in the next video, but the idea here is if a proposition about the future is true now, let's say, does that mean that it's necessary that it's true now? And that's going to be, we'll see that thought, that there's this connection between a proposition being true now and it being necessarily true, is one that has led a lot of people astray. And people get confused about this. So here's the main reason. So I've mentioned a couple of senses of openness which we've rejected straight away as being the content of our intuition. So the first one that I've rejected is the epistemic openness. The second one I've rejected is the causal openness. But then we've got these other two, modal openness and alethic openness. And I think that they can cause confusion unless we get clear about them, and that's why we've introduced them, because we are going to try and get clear about them. So the second video should start to make all of this make sense. So just to emphasize again, I'm aware at the moment that this is just bringing in distinctions, and okay, so the second video should explain it. So all I've done now is outline these different senses of openness. Okay, so let's turn to that second video.